You're listening to Seattle Real Estate Podcast.
So here on the Seattle Real Estate Podcast, we talk a lot about lack of supply, how competitive the real estate market is. If you're in the market for buying a home, it's just a brutal process. You are competing against a ton of other people, oftentimes with cash. One narrative that's always out there is, well, investors are always buying everything up. And that's not necessarily true. But in today's story, we're going to focus on how much the investors are really impacting the real estate market. And I'm usually of the opinion of, okay, they're buying some up, but not enough to really rock the market. Right now, you've got a really strong run by investors. And that's what we're going to talk about. Not just here in Seattle, we're going to look at some other markets and see what percentage of sales that are going on are being purchased by investors. And another crazy factor here is these investors, oftentimes these are cash transactions. So if you are a first-time home buyer, if you're a millennial, if you're, you've just gotten your whole credit together, got your down payment together, and you're out there competing, if you're competing against a cash offer, and I had this conversation yesterday with first-time home buyer, how do I get my offer accepted? Well, and the conversation usually goes, why would a seller accept your offer if they've got a cash offer on the table that's equal to yours, and yours is dependent upon financing? Why would they take that? Well, they wouldn't, and that's what's happening. So we're going to talk about a number of these factors today. Before we jump on in, if you're new here, welcome. My name is Sean Reynolds. I own a couple of real estate companies here in the Seattle area, and I read the news. Sometimes it's about real estate. Sometimes it's about other stuff, craziness in Seattle. This one, we're gonna do a deep dive into an actual real estate topic. But this impacts everybody, because if you're a homeowner, or if you're a potential homeowner, or if you're a seller, these are the factors going on. If you're a renter, this is what's impacting a lot of what's going on in the rent component. You're going to be impacted by this one way or the other, because housing, it's a thing. And we've got such a lack of affordable housing throughout so many markets right now that these are some of the components that are driving what's going on. The third quarter was investors' most prolific one on record. Investors as far as real estate investors, accounting for a full 18.2% of homes that sold across the U.S. All right, so when I saw that what I automatically equate that to is 1 out of 5 homes are being purchased by investors. That's a lot. That is a lot. Historically, that is a lot. Usually investors, we're going to look at the numbers, but they're a fraction of that. Let's just put it that way. And this is according to Seattle-based Redfin Corporation. Redfin wouldn't lie to us, would they? No. Now, Redfin's usually got pretty good data. They're a publicly traded company, and it's according to Redfin, which found real estate investors snapped up 90,215 homes in quarter 3, worth a combined almost $64 billion. The number of homes purchased in the third quarter by investors was up 10% from the prior quarter. So between quarter 2 and quarter 3 of this year, and bear with me, I know this is some kind of boring stuff, and we're going to go through some data, and we're not going to talk about how bad Seattle sucks, but this stuff it's important because it kind of puts a spotlight on, all right, here's one factor that's really driving the market. And we all understand how much housing has gone up, and everybody's kind of like, well, how much further can this bad boy go as far as the market? And when you've got investors jumping in like this, I think it's a pretty good indicator of, this market's still got a little bit of run left in it. So we've got third quarter, between the second quarter and the third quarter, investors were up. Their activity was up 10% from the prior quarter between 2 and 3, and jumped 80% from the same time a year prior. So year over year, investors up 80% in their purchases in the real estate market. That's an insane number right there. Redfin defines an investor as any business or institution that purchases residential real estate. All right, fair enough. So Daryl Fairweather, chief economist at Redfin, said the data doesn't discern how much of investors' purchases are by institutionally backed groups. Those are the big investment companies. Think like Blackstone-ish. or mom and pop investors. Those are the investors that typically own 10 or less units and oftentimes own less than 4 units. Small investors, but they're making up a broad component of who's buying real estate. Although she noted second home purchases remain elevated. And those are folks buying, they got their primary resident, they're buying their second residence. Maybe they spend some time there in that second residence. Maybe they rent that out, ish kind of thing. Even though they're not supposed to. It's supposed to be second home, just you living there. Yeah, but we do a little Airbnb on the side. Everybody's got that going, right? So on average, investors spent $438,000 on a home in quarter 3, a 5.3% jump from quarter 3 of 2020. So what we're saying here is that they are basically investing. The sweet spot is, let's call it 440,000. That is kind of the focal point here of what the majority of these investors are purchasing. 440 grand, because you can get a decent down payment. You don't have to put all your cash if you're a smaller investor. Maybe you're putting 100 grand down. Maybe you're doing 25% down. It's a little bit less than that, but something along those lines, 20% down. And then your rental income is going to hopefully cover the majority of your principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. Or in a lot of these instances, they're writing a check for the whole 440, right? So a 5.3% jump from quarter 3 of 2020. Of all investor home purchase in quarter 3, here's the kicker that I looked at that I was like, all right, so of all these investor homes that were purchased in quarter 3 that we just finished, 76.8% of them were all cash deals. That to me is the number that I looked at and went, ooh, wow, we are bringing some money to the table here as far as investors goes. That's a pretty crazy number to me right there. The Sun Belt continued to be the most popular region for investors. Just talked with my mortgage guy, Dan Chapman of Fairway Independent Mortgage, and he's got he just purchased a rental investment property. Second home, who knows what it is. Dan, fill us in Tempe. And this is a lot of what is going on. And he lives in Montana. So you've got people, because you can have managers come in and you can do the Airbnb. It's a pretty easy way to get into the real estate market and, have some offsetting income, so you just don't have a house sitting there empty while you're not using it if it is a second type home. So the Sun Belt continue to be the most popular region for investors. In Atlanta, nearly 1/3 or 32% of all home purchasers in the third quarter were by investors, the most of any metro area. So the Sun Belt and like Phoenix area that's been off to the races. Seattle, not as much, because I think our pricing is just too high in a lot of the markets where pricing is too high. It doesn't make sense to buy. Other than the fact that your appreciation here in the Seattle market is off the charts, but it takes such an entry chunk to get in. It's difficult to buy a rental property here and have those numbers pencil. And if you are paying cash, you've got a wad of cash into something that may not, when you look on the return on cash on cash return, it may not be as great as what you think after you're done with all the other real estate related stuff expense-wise. Atlanta also saw the biggest year-over-year gain, with investor market share rising to 32% in quarter 3 from 12.9% a year prior. So 32% in quarter 3, up from, call it, 13% a year earlier. Those are some big numbers. That's almost tripling. Yeah, it's a little bit shy of tripling. So investors are gaining market share. I think they have jumped in because they're like, man, this real estate market across the U.S. is red hot. And another factor is rising rents. That's something that we've talked about here a lot, because rents are rising. You don't have anywhere to go. You constrict that supply. And so many of the things we talk about here on this podcast are specific to Seattle, but they are happening across the U.S. When you constrict that supply of rental housing, you've got this eviction moratorium that's on again, off again. All right, CDC, we need you to help out and throw one in there. Oh, that's not constitutional. Oh, okay. You've got landlords that are like, yeah, you know what? I've got some good equity here. Market's going crazy. I'm going to sell this bad boy. I'm going to take my cash. I'm going to put it in the stock market because I'm going to get 30% return there. You got folks saying that because when you have an asset that you can't control, you can't kick the tenants out if they're not abiding by the lease. If they're not paying, you can't kick them out during the whole coronavirus thing. Who wants to go through that again? Well, you're getting a good enough income, and if your tenants are paying, maybe you stick it out and you hang in there. But in a lot of these markets, folks are giving homes up. They're selling because it's a ripe time to sell, and they don't want to have to go through another lockdown deal where you've got an eviction moratorium and all the chaos that's brought. So let's look at. We've got a chart here with 40 metropolitan statistical areas in the U.S. Then I'm going to scroll down so I can kind of get the bottom of the chart here for those of you on the audio component. All right, let's just take a look at sales of the market areas that have had a big chunk. So nearly, let's call it 25% of the market in Tampa, Florida were investor purchases. Phoenix, Arizona, we're going to call that like 33%. So like 1 out of every 3 purchases in Phoenix, and that's the greater area there, is an investment property. That doesn't surprise me. That's like my buddy Dan. Let's look at, how about Nashville, Tennessee? We're up, call it 22.5%. Those are some of the bigger ones. What else do we have? We've got Jacksonville, Florida. All right. That's an affordable market. Las Vegas, Nevada, another affordable market. Miami, Florida, a roughly affordable market. And by affordable, I mean you can buy a rental property in some of those, areas and it makes sense. Whereas you go to like a San Francisco or a Seattle, you don't have that affordability. And so those markets oftentimes were not on the list. So let's see what percentage of the purchases in Seattle. Less than 10%, probably about 8% are purchased by investors. So that kind of tells you where you're at. How about San Jose, California, tech market? That is about probably 13-14% of their purchases are by investors. San Francisco, close to 20 there. They've had such a run in San Francisco. It's just crazy. San Diego, almost 20. Riverside, California, well, they're down about 16%. Providence, Rhode Island, less than, probably about 7%. Portland, Oregon, about the same as Seattle, like 14% or so. So you kind of get the idea there. Some of those California markets, I think people are just looking at a straight appreciation going, they're licking their chops at that. And in some of those markets, you can still get a decent property because your rents are just so high. In Seattle, our rents are still rising at a pretty hard rate because our rents were fairly affordable relative to some of these other markets like San Francisco. So let's kind of keep going here. So that's kind of a general idea of where some of these big cities fall within the percentages. But anytime you've got between 15 and 30% of your market being purchased by investors, it creates some weird dynamics within the marketplace. Normal people can't compete with cash offers. That's the bottom line. I'm not saying all these transactions that are out there, they're obviously not happening by investors. But when you've got that in the mix, maybe every third home that you're making an offer on, it gets taken out by an investor. That's a lot of pressure on the marketplace for normal people looking to buy an owner-occupied, primary residential purchase. So outside of the Sun Belt, tertiary metros that have become hot housing markets like Boise, Idaho, also saw robust investor activity. Fairweather said single-family homes represented about 74% of investor purchases in quarter 3, as opposed to attached properties like townhouses and condos. Single-family detached homes made up 74% of the investor purchases. That's a crazy number right there. That's a trend that'll likely continue unless and until a strong return to the urban core, such as going back to the office, takes place, she said. One of the things I was talking to my older son, Kieran, who is an appraiser and a Summit real estate broker, was that how much the condo market has been impacted by the whole pandemic, because single-family detached homes, going like crazy. Condos in downtown areas, not so much. Not so much. I mean, they've just been kind of in this holding pattern. They're still selling, but oftentimes it takes a while. People don't want to be cooped up in a big condo project if they have the option for the same amount of money to go to, maybe it's not as nice a unit, but it's a single family home. They've got a little more space, a little more privacy. They're going down that road, and investors are as well, because that's the demand that's out there right now. It's not for condos or townhouses that are attached to other units. People want their privacy. They don't want to be next door to the guy or gal who's got the Rona, got the dreaded Rona. I think that's part of the pandemic trend for more space, Fairweather said. Investors see that as probably going to persist. People are moving away from downtown job centers and more towards the suburbs. Okay, but we also talk about the return to downtown core, and that has happened a little bit. I think a lot of the big tech companies most recently have they've tapped the brakes on that just a little bit. Yeah, we're going to let you work from home for the foreseeable future, so you can just kind of keep doing your thing. Here in Seattle, we're watching that because a lot of the small businesses are being impacted from the fact that they don't have 25,000 employees within a couple of block radius in some of these big downtown high-rise office complexes. So you've got, all those folks are still at home. They're going to their local suburban areas. They are not going to downtown because they're not being forced to go there on a daily basis. So you've had this, it's kind of been this back and forth. We're coming, you're all going to be back here in the office. And there certainly has been there's a lot more people going back to downtown, but they're not all there yet. That's been kind of put on hold. I think not investors, but employers, especially the big employers and the tech ones, they saw the Delta variant come out and they kind of decided, you know what? We said we wanted everybody back in the office, but we're gonna change our minds on that again. So that is literally straight up happening. It's not shocking. It's not surprising. I thought we'd have more of a full tilt. You all just got to come back. But from the standpoint of they can still have their employees basically doing the same job, you just don't have, a lot of that creative juices going with all those great meetings where you're all sitting around the table and they bring lunch in, all that good stuff. Don't have that going on right now. But given where we are with the pandemic, who knows when we're going to go back to that? I don't know. Historically, single-family rentals have made up 30 to 36% of all rental housing stock, said Don Walker, managing principal and chief. You don't care about that. Right now, the national average is about 33%, he added. Okay, so 1 out of every 3 rentals in this analysis is basically single-family detached housing. Rent growth for single-family rental properties is also growing rapidly, which would likely continue to propel investor activity. So you've got no supply of homes for sale. You've got limited supply of rental for rent. And it's not so much that we don't have enough rental housing. A lot of it is it's so expensive that it's not affordable to anybody in the mid or lower tiers at all. It's just rents have gone through the roof so hard that people can't afford them. So then, the narrative is there's no rental housing. Well, that's not true. It's just that things are really, really expensive and you've outpriced most folks from being able to afford that rental housing. So it's kind of like there's no rental housing, but there is, you know what I mean? So CoreLogic, a property data firm based in Irvine, California, this week released its single-family rental index for September, which found a national rent increase of 10% year over year for single-family rentals. That's up from a 2.6% year-over-year increase in September 2020. All right, 2.6% increase to 10.2% increase on rents on single-family homes. That is a bump. That's a massive bump in the single-family rental market. Molly Boesel, principal economist at CoreLogic, said detached rental housing units are seeing rates grow at a faster clip than attached units. We've talked about that a ton. People don't want to live next door to their neighbors. Those guys might have the Rona. We're not sure. Let's stay away. Let's have a little more privacy. Let's just keep things on the up and up, and you wear your mask, I'll wear mine, we'll hunker down, or maybe we're not wearing masks over here any which way. We don't want to be near you. That's literally what people are saying. I need my space. I just need to be able to do my own thing. Okay, in this next section, again, bear with me. Boring stuff, but important boring stuff, right? And this next section isn't really boring if you're into markets and real estate. So the growth rate of the most expensive homes being purchased for rental housing is growing faster incrementally. So like you've got the most expensive one, it's growing faster than the next expensive one, than the median one, and the lower priced units. So for example, lower priced units, 75% or less than the regional median, talking about the price range. So if they're 75% or less, they're a fraction of the median, regional median. That grew 8.3% year over year. All right. Lower price, the next most expensive kind of tier, that grew 9.3%. The higher priced middle units, now we're getting kind of more expensive. These are high priced units being purchased for rent. Those grew 10.5%. So we've gone 8.3, 9.3, 10.5, and the higher priced units, those are growing at 11%. So you've got this kind of inverse relationship between the price range of rental units to their desirability and what investors are buying. I thought that was super interesting because oftentimes on the higher end of things, you'll see that be, there just isn't that much activity. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that on the lower ends, there's virtually no supply at all for purchases in general. And on the higher end, you've got fewer people that can afford them. And yet, if you're an investor and you've got the money to do it, you're competing with less people because there's less people able to buy. So that's why I think some of those numbers it makes sense, but it's a little weird. It's only in a 2021 real estate market where everything should have tanked, but it didn't. And here we are, right? Much of the single-family rental demand is being driven by households that wish to buy but have been locked out of the competitive housing market. We've got so many buyers lined up on the Summit side of things. I mean, and these markets, I was just talking to one of my brokers that was here in the office yesterday, and we were talking about kind of the Kent, Auburn markets, which are, call it a 25-minute drive south of downtown Seattle, south and east. Kind of one of those suburban neighborhoods that's always been fairly affordable and yet has just been driven through the roof because of the dynamics we're talking about here. And those markets have gone from, you had stuff you could get at $400 that were affordable single family homes to $500. Now there's none of that on the market left, like none. If there is, it's junk. You might not be able to get conventional financing, to $600. So 4 to 5 to 6. Boom, boom, boom. That has happened within the last 18 months. I mean, those are some crazy, crazy numbers. And you're taking out basically, markets fairly close in, an affordable commuter type home. And now you're going next level. Now you're going to be traveling at least an hour, if not longer, to be getting that $400,000 home, $500,000 home that will become the $600,000 home. And that's in a metro market like Seattle, where you've got a limited amount of supply of housing anyway. So if a household can't find what they want to buy in their area or at their price range, a single family rental would be their best substitution for that. And that is what is driving a lot of these investors. They know that they've got a captive audience because there's so many people who, for whatever reason, maybe they don't have the down payment, maybe they don't have the credit history yet, maybe they've got bad credit they're working on. And if you've got bad credit, you can work with a credit counselor and get that credit up. Here's the deal. You got to pay your bills on time. Yeah, I know. That's a difficult concept and it's tricky. You got to pay your bills on time and you got to be smart with your money. You can't have millions of open credit cards with high balances. So, you just got to be reasonable, right? And it sounds like that's easy, but to get to there, that's another concept. Work with a credit counselor or work with somebody who can give you some tips. If you go to a mortgage person, they always have somebody that they can recommend, because if they get a buyer, a mortgage guy, if I as a real estate broker send one of my clients or somebody that's going to be a Summit client, I don't handle a lot personally anymore. If I send a potential buyer to a mortgage broker and they pull up their credit and go, your credit sucks, you can't buy. You don't want that process to end. You want to be able to help those folks out. So oftentimes what they'll do is they'll work to get that credit up. So these are not insurmountable things. So maybe you don't have the credit, maybe you don't have the down payment, maybe you don't have the job with the affordable, component of it to live where you want to live. To make that happen, you're going to rent. That's why you got such demand for investors right now buying this stuff. Walker said it's hard to predict what will happen, but the firm is forecasting continued single-family rental growth into 2022, which will likely translate to more investment in the space. Institutional groups armed with billions have launched new single-family rental platforms this year or are expanding their existing portfolios. That's something that I'm keeping a pretty close eye on, because that means you've got, these big investment companies. For example, Zillow, which just closed up their iBuyer model. They're bleeding out, millions of dollars. Their whole business model didn't really pan out. I've done a few podcasts on that, and for various obvious reasons, mainly the, let's call it quote unquote, unpredictability of projecting real estate values. Now, the rest of the market seems to be doing just fine here, don't they? Zillow, and I throw out Zillow as an example of an iBuyer, which is what a lot of people see as competing buyers to a standard single-family purchase. And that is happening. But what you're seeing more of is you're seeing more just straight purchases of single-family homes by a variety of investors. And that's what we're saying here. A variety of investors. And it doesn't matter who they are at the end of the day. If you're competing against an investor who has more money or more cash or more firepower, it's really hard for your typical buyer, which is, call it your whatever the family unit is that you're working with a normal job with, kids and pets and car payments and, all that stuff. They don't have a massive chunk to put down on this home. And so those are our buyers on the Summit end of things, along with some investors. We handle our fair share of investors as well, too. But you've got these competing entities, and that's what I kind of keep a close watch on is, all right, when's this market going to tilt one way or the other? When's it going to become more, less fast-paced? And when are the normal purchasers going to have the ability to compete more in this marketplace? And we're not there yet, and we may not be there for a while because the supply has been so constricted. We don't have enough supply. I think that in our last market in a minute that I did, where I talked for 1 minute about the real estate market, we had 0.66 months of supply system-wide here in the Puget Sound Northwest Multiple Listing Service. That is essentially sold out. That's sold out, folks. That's what we're running on all the time. So that's why these real estate numbers have been so wacky. You've got big demand, you've got virtually no supply, and that, that goes towards both the appreciation of single family homes, but also to the rent increases that we're seeing. So the pandemic has shown us that during a very trying time, single family rental held up pretty well from an asset class perspective, Walker said. I think that's one of the things that's attracted capital to the space, at least from institutional investors. I think institutional investors they're taking a big chunk out of this market. They are. It's not what you see on Twitter, which are these horror stories of, they're buying out 35 homes and then they're, just that whole thing in the marketplace where you've got these gross exaggerations of what's going on. Yeah, there's more investors in the marketplace, guaranteed. That is happening, but it's not an overwhelming number. But if you're a buyer and you don't have a big down payment, it sure feels like an overwhelming number because you might have made 10 offers and you haven't gotten a single one. So what I recommend to people is just be patient, really analyze where you're going to be, and kind of plan accordingly. You can make it happen. It's just you're going to have to put a lot more effort into it than you may want to. And you're going to have to be really smart about where you're going to live, what you can accept. And it's kind of like you're going to need to reduce those expectations. Nobody wants to hear that. Everybody wants to hear, yeah, I can live in, the ideal cities. I can get my ideal housing. All that has basically gone out the window during the pandemic entirely. Learn to settle. You hate to say it, but that's what's reasonable. If you're living in a big metropolitan city that has big demand for housing, you go further out, competitive market. Go to a different city, competitive market. Might be a couple hours drive, but less competitive market, you can get in. And, but you're not going to be going to all the concerts and cool restaurants and all that stuff that you find in that big metropolitan market. Maybe you don't want that. Maybe you want to do your own thing, and that's fine. Fairweather said that if interest rates rise next year, which they will, that could slow investor purchase activity, but that would also slow the overall housing market. All right, that is true, but look at how many of these are cash purchases. Maybe they're refinancing on the other end. We've certainly seen a lot of that from the Reynolds and Klein end of things, where people come in and buy, they'll purchase a home cash, and then 2 weeks later, they'll come back and put a mortgage on it because you come in with a cash offer, you're going to blow everybody else out of the water. You get the house, and then you go back and do a cash out refinance and get your cash out and move on to the next project or whatever. And then you leave your 20% equity stake in the home in the form of the mortgage, covering the other 80%. So a lot of that going on. It's been a wild market, and it doesn't really feel like it's slowing down here in Seattle. I'm reading other areas of the country are slowing down. But is that a seasonal thing? Is that a weather-related thing? Man, we had some rain here in Seattle. Up north, you got towns, I should say. You got towns underwater. You'll see videotape, and maybe you've watched some of the weather stories. We have these big, rivers, and they get all filled up, and you've got rain coming off the mountains into the rivers and the lowlands, and those flood, and just big debacle. But if you're from the Seattle area, you kind of know that those areas, they flood. And, that's just kind of the deal. So things like that seasonally, those slow down a real estate market for sure. Going into the holidays, that slows things down. You've got Thanksgiving, you've got Christmas, real estate brokers, mortgage brokers, everybody in that food chain, they tend to hunker down a little bit over the holidays because they've had a good year. And they're gone hunting. Is that how the saying goes? Gone hunting. You put the sign on the business door, you're gone. And, the Seattle version of that is gone to Maui, and they're doing whatever. So you've got slowdowns like that. But with the lack of supply we've got in the marketplace right now, I think come January, January 10th, January 15th, and that used to be, March 1. But now it's like January 10th, market starts to rock again. It's because there's no supply and people are getting a jump on things. And with the interest rates, you're going to hear a lot about interest rates are rising. Interest rates are going up. You got to jump on in. Yeah, that's true. It is true. But, we knew rates were going to rise at some point in time. So it's all kind of relative, right? So yeah, we've got this is another year where I didn't think we'd be at the same point, which is, big demand, super historically low interest rates. They've bumped around a little bit. They've gone up, they've come down, they've gone up. So there's a little volatility there, but I didn't really think at the end of 2021, we'd still be talking about, we got no supply. You know what I mean? It's, and we've still got big demand. I thought it would have petered out. But now we're doing stories on, hey, now look at all the investors in the marketplace. It's and it makes sense because the return is there and they're able to, plunk their money into this stuff and it's doing well and rents are rising. And for the foreseeable future, I think you're going to see rents rise. So it kind of makes sense to be jumping in if you're an investor. And that, of course, impacts normal people trying to get a little tiny piece of the American dream. That little tiny piece of the American dream, which is, a house, man, that's become difficult. Not easy, especially for the first-time home buyer and especially for the millennial generation, of which I have 2 children in that. And I'm like anybody else. I'm like, geez, how are these guys going to get a home? What are they going to have to do? I mean, how many of them are going to have to go in on a home, or how much of their life is going to be dedicated to working to pay that mortgage because things are so darn expensive? Those are things that I think about. And so, strong real estate markets, it's got its good, it's got its bad. You just got to deal with it and figure out what makes sense for you. Maybe living in Seattle, maybe that doesn't make any sense for you. One of the funny things I saw last week was somebody was pointing out at one of our parks here in Seattle, just the craziness that goes on. We've got Lawnmower Man in Ballard. We've got double-decker RV with the homeless recording studio. They're making a lot of noise. And somebody pointed out in the comments, I always read the comments because I think the comments on a lot of YouTube videos they're funnier than the actual video. The comments were, so you've got all this craziness going on. You got Lawnmower Man, and yet you've got homes that are worth over $1 million facing into all these crazy stories going on. You're like, how does that work? How does it work? Yeah, that's what we're doing. And that's what's happening. And sometimes it's $2 million. Sometimes it's $3 million on a home looking in on Lawnmower Man. Just wild times. Yeah, but that's what we're doing in Seattle and a lot of these other markets. They're going strong too. What will happen in 2022? Well, I've got a bunch of videos that'll be coming out. I'm going to bring my mortgage guy in, Dan Chapman from Fairway Independent Mortgage, and we're going to talk about what we see, being the trends for 2022. So we'll look for that in the near future here. It's what we're doing. All right. So, hey, we did an actual real estate podcast on the Seattle Real Estate Podcast. We should be proud. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being a part. We'll catch up soon. Until then, stay safe. We'll talk again. Bye for now. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you'll know when our next video is out.